Cold air clung to the ground near Smolensk on August 6, 1941, spreading a thin layer of mist over the dim airfield, where Senior Lieutenant Viktor Talalikhin, barely 23, prepared for another night interception. Oil fumes drifted from nearby repair sheds, mixing with the sharp scent of burned grass left by earlier bombardments. The engines of grounded fighters murmured like restless animals waiting to be released, their metal skins still warm from the previous day's frantic launches. Viktor moved through the half-light with a stiff, deliberate pace, his muscles aching from sleepless nights spent in the cockpit or dozing on fuel crates. The mechanics stepped back as he climbed into his battered I-16, a machine scarred by weeks of brutal fighting. The canopy glass rattled slightly when he pulled it closed, hinting at past impacts the frame had barely survived. Inside the cramped cockpit, the air felt heavy, carrying traces of gasoline, sweat, and scorched rubber. His fingers hovered over the controls, steady but tense, because he knew the weapon system had misfired twice during the last 24 hours. The guns might work, or they might betray him again at the worst possible moment. Darkness shifted above the treetops as he taxied onto the runway. A single flare burned low in the distance, casting an orange streak across the field and reflecting faintly off his propeller blades. Each second of acceleration brought a deeper vibration through the fuselage, the engine coughing before catching rhythm. A sudden burst of wind rattled the wings, reminding him how fragile the aircraft truly was. Still, the fighter surged upward, climbing into a sky stained by distant fires where German bombers had passed only hours earlier. Higher up, the clouds parted to reveal a faint moonlit corridor. Viktor pushed the throttle forward, feeling the aircraft strain as it clawed for altitude. Sweat formed under his collar despite the cold, and his heartbeat thudded against the harness straps with a steady, anxious force. Moscow lay far behind him, vulnerable and shaken after relentless air raids that left entire districts smoldering through the night. Every pilot understood that another heavy strike could cripple ammunition reserves or ignite fuel depots vital for survival. A faint drone reached him from the west, low and rhythmic, like a mechanical tide rolling through the dark. He steadied his breathing and angled toward the sound, knowing that dozens of engines could be hiding beyond the horizon. The moonlit haze thickened around him until silhouettes appeared, slow, bulky shapes cutting across the night in silent formation. He guided his fighter closer, the bomber outlines growing sharper with every heartbeat. The first burst of enemy tracer fire sliced past his canopy, painting the darkness with fleeting red streaks. His plane shuddered as he dove beneath the formation, searching for an opening before they reached Moscow's outskirts. The guns in his wings were loaded, but he carried no certainty they would respond. He wiped his glove across the frost forming on the inside of the glass and set his jaw with a quiet, resolute calm. The sky ahead filled with enemy metal, and every instinct in him tightened. Viktor pushed forward anyway, committing himself fully to whatever would happen next. The first weeks of the German invasion hammered Soviet aviation with relentless force, leaving entire regiments gutted before many pilots even reached their aircraft. Burned rubber, scorched aluminum, and the sour scent of spilled fuel lingered on shattered runways where hundreds of fighters lay overturned or melted into the asphalt. Every morning began with smoke drifting across fields once used for training drills, now scarred with craters and scattered fragments of propellers twisted by the heat of sudden explosions. Pilots who survived ground strikes scrambled into the air with machines patched together from whatever parts remained intact. The older I-15s and I-16s struggled against modern German formations that advanced in tight, layered boxes. These formations created walls of defensive fire that chewed through interceptors before they even reached effective firing distance. Reports from frontline airfields recorded losses so steep that many squadrons could barely muster a handful of flyable aircraft. Ground crews worked through nights lit by lanterns, their hands stained with oil and grit as they rushed to repair wings buckled by gunfire. Despite the chaos, orders from command insisted on rigid adherence to outdated doctrine. Pilots were told to conserve ammunition, maintain standard approach paths, and avoid any tactic deemed wasteful. Such directives might have made sense in peacetime, but the sky over Moscow had become a corridor of flame. German Tu-111 bombers slipped through gaps in Soviet defense networks with unnerving precision, guided by crews trained to navigate by sound and shadow. Their engines rumbled over the capital almost nightly, dropping payloads that shattered warehouses, fuel reserves, and sleeping neighborhoods. Radar coverage remained limited, forcing observers to rely on sound posts and flashes of moonlight to track incoming raids. Many warnings came too late, leaving interceptors scrambling into the sky only to find themselves surrounded by enemy aircraft. Talalikhin's unit, already reduced by attrition, was assigned night interception duties they had scarcely practiced. Darkness swallowed their approach paths, leaving pilots blind except for faint silhouettes flickering between clouds. Their confidence wore thin as they climbed into these missions, knowing how little stood between them and disaster. The most demoralizing threat came from the machines themselves. Soviet machine guns jammed unpredictably, firing only brief bursts before choking on overheated barrels or warped feed trays. Pilots often returned with ammunition untouched simply because their guns refused to respond. Commanders dismissed complaints, urging crews to clean the weapons more thoroughly, but everyone on the ground understood the truth. Metallurgy shortages and rushed factory output had compromised reliability. Talalikhin had witnessed friends die with full magazines, their final moments marked by helpless dives into swarms of bombers they could not harm. Each failed interception fed a growing sense of hopelessness. German crews flew deeper into Soviet airspace with increasing confidence, their bombs striking industrial zones essential for the defense of Moscow. One more week of successful raids could cripple ammunition production or ignite the massive fuel storage sites near the city's outskirts. Talalikhin recognized the bleak pattern forming around him. The system he served was cracking under the weight of a war that had arrived faster and harder than anyone predicted. Inside that collapse lay the conflict already building around him, a pilot trapped between rigid doctrine and an enemy accelerating toward victory. During one of the chaotic night sorties, Talalikhin found himself flying through a sky thick with smoke drifting from burning villages below. His guns opened with a brief, hopeful crackle before dissolving into a dull metallic click that echoed painfully inside the cockpit. The sudden silence pressed against his ears, leaving only the roar of the engine and the faint hum of distant bombers. Tracer fire crossed his path like thin, glowing wires, forcing him to roll sharply to avoid the spreading pattern of red lines. He felt the old I-16 vibrate under the strain, its wooden frame trembling as he pulled away from the bomber formation. As he regained altitude, an old rumor flickered across his memory. Veteran pilots from the previous winter had claimed to bring down enemy aircraft by striking them with their landing gear or propeller when ammunition ran dry. Commanders dismissed such stories as reckless bravado. They insisted a pilot should protect his machine, not turn it into a projectile. Still, the thought lingered like an ember refusing to die. Talalikhin kept replaying the moment his guns failed, listening to that hollow click until it merged with the sound of wind rushing past the cockpit. Later that evening, he watched a bomber formation from a hillside near the airfield. The sky glowed orange as fires smoldered across distant fields, offering faint silhouettes of aircraft climbing toward Germany. He noticed something in the rigid symmetry of their formation. Every bomber relied heavily on its tail gunner, who controlled a narrow arc of fire. Above that arc, a vulnerable strip stretched across the aircraft's spine, barely covered by the dorsal turret. If a fighter approached from a steep angle, the gunners would lose their ability to track it effectively. This weakness carved a path through his thoughts. If he approached from above and slightly behind, he could strike the bomber's stabilizer or wing root. The idea felt reckless, yet strangely precise. He imagined the angle, the closing speed, the moment the two aircraft merged into a burst of torn aluminum. The risk was absolute. Any miscalculation would tear his fighter apart and send him spiraling into the burning countryside below. The fear of such an end pressed heavily against his ribs. Death in the sky came fast, often without warning, and he had seen enough shattered wreckage to understand what awaited a pilot who misjudged a maneuver by seconds. Still, something stronger than fear pushed against his hesitation. Moscow had endured wave after wave of night raids, and every failure to stop them meant more families crushed under collapsing rooftops or trapped inside burning factories. Talalikhin returned to the airfield with the idea swelling inside him like a secret he could not share. The command would never authorize a tactic that risked losing aircraft already in short supply. No instructor would teach a maneuver that demanded perfect timing at lethal speed. But he felt the invisible line tightening around him as the enemy advanced. At some point soon, he would face another bomber with empty guns and a sky that offered no escape. That night, as the mechanics worked under flickering lantern light, he ran his hand along the fighter's damaged wing. The metal felt cold and uneven beneath his glove, marked by past impacts that somehow hadn't destroyed it. He imagined that same wing cutting through the tail of a HE-111. A dangerous resolve settled over him. If his guns failed again, he would not break away. He would ram, deliberately, and with purpose. Night settled heavily over the countryside, pressing a velvet darkness against the treetops as Talalikhin rolled his fighter onto the runway. The smell of damp soil rose from the surrounding fields, mixing with the richer scent of hot engine oil as the I-16's motor began its uneven rumble. A faint tremor shivered through the fuselage when he advanced the throttle, and the aircraft lurched forward with a growl that rippled across the quiet airfield. Lanterns near the maintenance tents flickered in the backwash, their yellow halos shrinking as the fighter accelerated into the blackness. Once airborne, he climbed through a layer of thin mist that beaded across the canopy and blurred the landscape below. The radio crackled with short-clipped reports from ground observers who had spotted a formation of bombers moving northeast at low altitude. Talalikhin adjusted his heading, feeling the aircraft strain as he coaxed more power out of its weary engine. The cold seeped through his gloves, numbing his fingers as he gripped the control stick. Every breath formed a faint cloud that drifted up toward the canopy before being swept aside by the vibration of the frame. At 02:20, he cleared the last cloud band and saw them, dark shapes sliding across the moonlit sky in smooth, deliberate formation. Their engines pulsed with a deep, synchronized rhythm that carried across the night like distant thunder rolling over open plains. He eased closer, skimming the formation's edge until the tail gunner of the nearest bomber opened fire. Red tracers whipped past his cockpit, ripping thin, glowing arcs through the air. He rolled away, feeling the sting of cold sweat along his spine. He lined up for a standard firing run, squeezed the trigger, and felt the guns respond with a short burst. The muzzle flash lit the wing root for a heartbeat before the weapon system locked again with a hollow clack. The familiar failure hit him like a blow to the chest. His hands tightened around the controls as he pulled aside, letting the bomber slip beneath him while he tried to clear the jam through rapid mechanical taps. Nothing changed. The guns remained dead weight, bolted to his wings. The moment he had imagined on the hillside now surged back with startling clarity. He angled his fighter upward, climbing above the bomber formation until the moonlight washed across the curved surface of his wing. The wind roared against the cockpit frame as he banked sharply, positioning himself for the attack he had promised only to himself. His first approach came too fast, forcing him to abandon the angle before the impact point aligned. The second attempt dragged him dangerously close to the bomber's swirling prop wash, shaking the I-16 so violently that his teeth clattered. He steadied the aircraft and tried again. This time, he committed fully, pushing the nose down in a controlled dive that placed his wingtip inches from the bomber's tailplane. The collision erupted in a burst of metal fragments that showered the night with sparks. The He-111 lurched sideways, its left stabilizer torn clean from the fuselage. Flames spilled from the ruptured fuel line as the bomber dropped into a widening spiral, vanishing into the clouds below. The impact rocked Talalikhin's fighter, nearly flipping it onto its back. He fought the sudden roll with sharp, decisive movements, forcing the trembling aircraft back into level flight. The engine sputtered once before catching rhythm again, leaving only the harsh smell of scorched paint drifting into the cockpit. He had done the impossible. He was alive, and the bomber was not. Talalikhin staggered out of his cockpit at dawn, the horizon glowing with a pale red haze that clung to the tree line like lingering smoke. Mechanics rushed toward the damaged I-16, their boots crunching over frost-coated gravel as they circled the fighter in stunned silence. The wing surface bore deep scars where metal had buckled under the collision, leaving jagged edges sharp enough to catch the morning light. Burned fuel and hot oil drifted from the cooling engine, giving the air a heavy, metallic scent that clung to every breath. Within hours, word of the night ramming spread across the regiment. Pilots gathered around the fighter, leaning close to study the torn paneling as if the metal itself held instructions. Some examined the damage with cautious admiration, while others shook their heads at the sheer audacity of surviving such an impact. Their discussions grew louder, mixing fear, relief, and curiosity until officers intervened to restore order. Rumors reached divisional headquarters before noon, carried upward by urgent reports that described a deliberate aerial collision rather than an accidental strike. By late afternoon, senior engineers arrived by truck, stepping onto the airfield with clipboards tucked beneath their coats. They traced their gloved hands along the damaged wing, murmuring calculations while the wind rustled through scattered tools and canvas tarps. One engineer tapped the wing root repeatedly, noting how the aircraft's wooden structure had absorbed the shock without collapsing entirely. Another measured the angle of the fracture, declaring it remarkably survivable under specific conditions. Their voices grew more animated as they debated reinforcement possibilities, though shortages of aluminum and plywood already strained every factory. As reports reached Moscow, high command analysts began drafting emergency memoranda that described the maneuver as a potential last resort interception. Training officers quickly rewrote sections of night combat instructions, adding discrete paragraphs about approaching bombers from above at steep angles. These additions circulated unofficially at first, passed hand to hand like contraband. Pilots practiced the method during daytime climbs using chalk lines drawn across hangar floors to visualize approach vectors. Airfields echoed with the sound of engines revving for short bursts, each test run sending vibrations through the ground like distant artillery. Not everyone welcomed the tactic. Some commanders condemned it as dangerous improvisation that wasted precious aircraft. They cited production shortages, reminding crews that every fighter lost might take weeks to replace. Still, the arguments felt thin against the growing number of successful interceptions attributed to desperate maneuvers. Pilots from neighboring regiments visited Talalikhin's base to observe the fighter firsthand. They arrived smelling of kerosene and sweat, their flight suits streaked with soot from nightly combat, pressure mounted on factories already working around the clock. Requests for reinforced wing panels, thicker spars, and bolted braces reached industrial planners who struggled to balance demands with raw material scarcity. Entire workshops buzzed with tension as workers welded new fittings by the glow of electric arcs that painted the walls blue. Sparks showered workbenches, casting twisting shadows that hinted at the scale of the crisis. Despite every obstacle, the tactic continued spreading through the ranks, quietly, urgently, inevitably. What had begun as one pilot's gamble now shifted the thinking of entire air units. Every new modification, Every training adjustment pushed the Soviet air defense closer to embracing a strategy born from necessity rather than doctrine. And with each passing night, the bombers kept coming. Clouds smudged the sky over the Istra Reservoir on the night of August 24th, forming dark, jagged shapes that drifted above the forests like torn curtains. The air felt unnaturally warm, carrying the smell of distant fires and the heavy residue of burned fuel settling across the ground. Talalikhin waited inside his patched I-16 as technicians tightened the last bolts on the wing brace, their tools clinking sharply under the glare of a single searchlight. The aircraft looked exhausted, its faded paint streaked with soot, yet it still responded with a familiar trembling hum when the engine coughed to life. At 23:40, the first report reached the airfield, an unusually dense bomber formation approaching from the west, flying low to mask their engines beneath the night wind. The moment the order came, Talalikhin pushed the throttle forward, and the fighter rolled into the darkness with a burst of raw acceleration. Cold air flooded the cockpit as the wheels lifted from the runway. The canopy rattled, and a faint whistle rose along the fuselage, cutting through the engine's rising pitch. He climbed steadily, feeling the aircraft strain beneath the weight of past repairs. The smell of smoke intensified as he reached altitude. A glowing arc of flames flickered far below where villages burned under earlier strikes. Above the haze, the bombers emerged in a broad formation, their navigation lights briefly revealing rows of silver frames, moving like a single mechanical organism. Their engines produced a low, rolling thunder that vibrated through his ribs. Talalikhin steadied his breathing and eased into position, slipping behind the formation's edge with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the moment countless times in silence. He gained a sliver of advantage when the nearest bomber drifted slightly out of alignment. Talalikhin dived, squeezed the trigger, and felt relief surge through him as the guns answered with a clean, sustained burst. The shells ripped across the bomber's left engine, igniting a plume of fire that bloomed against the dark sky. The aircraft lurched sideways and began a slow, doomed descent toward the forest. But as Talalikhin climbed above the formation again, a sharp metallic knock echoed through the cockpit. His guns jammed. Once more, the weapon system had failed. Enemy tracers carved red slashes upward, forcing him to roll violently to avoid the spreading curtain of fire. The wind roared against the canopy as he regained height, his vision narrowing into a tunnel of motion and instinct. The second bomber drifted directly beneath him, its dorsal gunner twisting desperately to track the maneuver. Talalikhin angled his fighter downward, letting gravity sharpen the descent. The collision struck with a brutal metallic crack that shuddered through his entire body. The bomber's wing tore open, releasing a burst of flame that scattered fragments into the sky. His fighter jerked sideways, momentarily losing balance as a wave of turbulence slammed against the left wing. He forced the controls back into alignment, teeth clenched as the aircraft wobbled through the smoke. Another bomber loomed ahead, barely illuminated by the burning wreckage behind him. He no longer had the luxury of choosing a safer approach. He lined up the angle, felt the vibrations grow sharper, and committed again. This impact tore through the bomber's tail section, sending it into a spinning collapse that vanished into the clouds below. But the strike crippled the I-16. The cockpit filled with the sting of burning paint, and the engine began coughing in uneven bursts. Talalikhin pulled upward, fighting for altitude as black streaks trailed across the canopy. A final sputter rattled the engine, and the propeller slowed into a helpless whine. The fighter could no longer hold the sky. Flames licked across the cowling as he unlatched the canopy and hurled himself into the cold night air. Wind tore at his suit while the darkness swallowed him whole. The parachute opened with a violent snap that jolted his spine, leaving him drifting downward as burning aircraft fell around him like collapsing stars. Talalikhin hit the ground hard, the impact driving a jolt through his legs and knocking the breath from his chest. Damp grass brushed against his gloves as he steadied himself, the earth beneath him still warm from scattered embers drifting down from the burning sky. Smoke hung low over the fields, spreading a bitter metallic taste across his tongue with every breath. A distant explosion rolled across the night, shaking loose a few glowing sparks from the canopy of trees nearby. He pulled the parachute harness free and listened to the muffled roar of engines fading toward the horizon. Within minutes, searchlights swept the darkness as Soviet patrols raced across the fields to locate the fallen pilot. Flashlights flickered between tree trunks before a pair of soldiers emerged from the shadows, their uniforms streaked with dust and soot. They recognized him immediately and guided him toward a waiting truck, its engine rattling with uneven rhythm. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of gasoline and damp wool, while the seats shook beneath every bump in the dirt road. Talalikhin leaned against the window pane, watching the sky dim as the fires slowly receded behind him. At dawn, officers gathered around a map table inside a makeshift command hut. Reports from observers along the reservoir confirmed at least 3 bombers destroyed, with another trailing smoke before disappearing behind the forest line. Some witnesses claimed a 4th had lost altitude after the final collision, though the crash site had not yet been located. Each statement added a sharp edge to the atmosphere inside the hut. Commanders leaned close, murmuring with restrained urgency as the significance of the night's events settled over them. Talalikhin sat nearby on a wooden crate, wrapped in a blanket that carried the faint smell of engine grease. His body throbbed with dull aches, yet his expression remained calm, almost detached, as if still suspended in the sky above the burning reservoir. A medic cleaned cuts along his cheek, wiping away soot that clung stubbornly to his skin. He listened to the officers debate the raid's outcome, their voices rising and falling like distant waves rolling against a rocky shore. News spread quickly through the regiment. Pilots approached him throughout the morning, some offering brief congratulations, others staring in disbelief at the scale of what he had accomplished. Their faces reflected a mixture of admiration and unease. The idea of ramming a bomber was no longer a rumor or an isolated act. It had become a demonstrated tactic, one that carried terrifying implications for every flyer in the unit. Each new retelling of the night's battle grew heavier, leaving behind a tension that clung to the air like smoke after an explosion. Official reports moved up the chain of command with remarkable speed. Moscow's air defense staff linked his actions to the disrupted bombing run, noting that ammunition depots targeted for destruction had survived the night without damage. Industrial planners estimated that even a single avoided strike might have preserved thousands of tons of critical supplies. Their calculations turned Talalikhin's gamble into something larger, a strategic interruption during a moment when every surviving facility mattered. German intelligence intercepted fragments of the story by morning. Analysts noted the sudden spike in bomber losses and tried to determine the cause. When they realized Soviet pilots had begun using deliberate collisions, the reaction inside Luftwaffe command sharpened into concern. Hitler, furious at the psychological effect such stories could create, reportedly forbade any mention of Talalikhin's name in military dispatches. Silence became the official policy. Talalikhin heard none of this directly. He remained in his bunk, staring at the canvas roof above him as the smell of disinfectant drifted through the barracks. He felt neither triumph nor fear, only a quiet, heavy awareness that the war had shifted around him. The night's battle had changed more than the course of a single raid. It had opened a new path, one paved with risk, desperation, and a determination strong enough to tear metal apart in mid-air. And the pilots around him understood that path now, whether they wished to or not. Weeks after the ramming attacks, Talalikhin returned to the air with a new aircraft, though the flight hours he logged became shorter and more strained as the autumn of 1941 descended across the front. The mornings carried the smell of damp leaves and cold metal, while the distant rumble of artillery rolled through the forests like a restless pulse. His comrades noticed a quiet intensity in him, a tightened focus that lingered even when he stood among them in the mess hall. War had carved new lines across his face, and every mission pushed them a little deeper. On a cold October evening, another fierce dogfight erupted over the outskirts of Moscow. Clouds streaked across the sky in long gray ribbons, revealing brief slivers of moonlight that illuminated the silhouettes of twisting aircraft. Talalikhin's fighter climbed into the chaos with the same decisive sharpness he carried during the earlier battles. Tracer rounds carved pale arcs around him, and the air smelled of burning fuel as damaged aircraft tumbled from the fight. In the confusion, he engaged a group of enemy fighters pressing toward defensive positions near Podolsk. Moments later, ground crews heard the explosive thud of an aircraft crashing beyond the tree line. Flames rose above the pines, spreading orange reflections across the damp branches. Local defenders pulled his shattered body from the wreckage, the smoke still rising from the broken fuselage. Word of his death reached the regiment at dawn, bringing a heavy, numbing silence that spread across the airfield like a slow-moving shadow. The pilots gathered near the damaged runway, their faces marked with a grief they tried to conceal behind discipline. But the legacy of his actions refused to fade. Reports from across the front documented a rapid increase in ramming attempts, each one carried out by pilots who had studied his maneuvers with relentless focus. By the end of the war, Soviet archives recorded over 600 deliberate aerial rammings, many executed during the darkest moments when ammunition ran low and entire cities hung in the balance. His name became synonymous with the tactic, marking him as the first pilot to achieve a controlled night ramming against an organized bomber formation. Military academies analyzed his collision angle, the approach vector, and the timing that had allowed his fighter to survive impacts previously assumed fatal. These details entered emergency combat manuals distributed quietly to regiments facing overwhelming air superiority. Instructors emphasized that the method belonged only to the most desperate circumstances, yet young pilots studied it with the solemn attention reserved for final lifelines. Monuments rose in the years that followed. His hometown erected a statue of him standing beside the outline of an I-16, its wings carved to reflect the jagged scars left by his collisions. Museums preserved fragments of the damaged aircraft recovered from his night missions, placing them beneath glass that reflected the soft glow of overhead lamps. Children pressed their hands against the display cases, staring at the torn metal that had once sliced through bomber formations in a sky filled with fire. Even beyond Soviet borders, military historians acknowledged his improbable achievement. German records, stripped of his name by official order, still contained traces of the fear his tactics created among bomber crews. Veterans remembered the sudden shock of seeing a fighter approaching from impossible angles, moving with a determination that ignored its own survival. His story continued to echo long after the smoke of war settled. It lived in training halls, flight manuals, and whispered recollections shared by aging pilots who remembered the terror of those early days. And though his life ended violently in the sky he tried to defend, the force of his actions extended far beyond a single night over Moscow. One pilot's resolve had reshaped the way a nation understood sacrifice. His legacy carried the weight of every life saved by a tactic born in the darkest hours of the war.